My son's father-in-law stood at the head of the conference table, pointing at Daniel's architectural drawings like they were something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "These are amateur work," Preston Ashford said, not bothering to lower his voice. "I've seen better designs from first-year interns." My son said nothing, just nodded and gathered his papers. When I reached across the table to straighten one of the drawings, Preston looked at me the way a man looks at something he's already decided is irrelevant. "And you brought your father. How sweet." He smiled at the room full of his associates. The retired mailman came to help. I set the drawing down carefully, folded my hands, smiled back. "I delivered more than mail," I said. He had absolutely no idea what I meant. Neither did my son. Not yet. Before we get into this, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We read every single one. Daniel called me on a Tuesday in February. He didn't call often, not because we weren't close, but because he was the kind of man who didn't want to burden anyone. His mother raised him that way. And after Carol passed 4 years ago, that quality in him made me proud and broke my heart in equal measure. "Dad, Preston wants to meet. Lunch Friday at his club. He wants to talk about the business." "What kind of talk?" Daniel paused. "He said it's an opportunity. He wants to bring Briggs Design into the Ashford Group as a subsidiary. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Marietta, about 30 minutes outside Atlanta. Nothing fancy. Carol and I bought it in 1989 for reasons that had nothing to do with status and everything to do with the school district, the quiet street, the neighbors who waved from their porches. After she passed, I kept the house because every room still carried something of her. Daniel's old soccer cleats were still in the hall closet. I didn't see any reason to change that. Preston Ashford lived in Buckhead. If you know Atlanta, you know what that means. His house was the kind of property that appears in architectural magazines with captions about defining the Atlanta skyline. He had a club membership, a box at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and a son-in-law whose small but growing architecture firm he'd been eyeing for 2 years. Briggs Design wasn't large. 11 employees, a solid reputation for residential and mid-size commercial work, and a client retention rate that any firm twice its size would envy. Daniel had built it from nothing, working out of a converted garage for the first 18 months, calling every contact he had, driving to every meeting himself. I'd watched him do it. I knew what that company cost him. The lunch at Preston's club was the first time I'd been in the same room as the man for more than 10 minutes. His wife, Diane, wasn't there. Just Preston, 2 of his associates whose names I didn't catch, Daniel, and me. Daniel had asked me to come. I wasn't sure why exactly, but I said yes without hesitating. The club dining room had that particular silence that expensive places cultivate deliberately. Hushed voices, thick carpet, servers who materialized and disappeared without being noticed. Preston ordered for the table without asking anyone's preference. He was 61 years old, tan in the way that money produces in February, with silver hair and a handshake designed to remind you who had the firmer grip. "So, you're the father," he said when Daniel introduced me. "What was it you did before you retired?" "I worked for the federal government." Preston nodded the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. "Civil service. Good pension, I imagine." Something like that. Daniel shot me a look I recognized, the look that said, "Please don't." I smiled and picked up the menu. The proposal Preston laid out was straightforward in the way that predatory things often are. Ashford Group would acquire a 60% controlling interest in Briggs Design. Daniel would remain as creative director, a title that sounded meaningful until you understood that all financial decisions, hiring, contracts, and client relationships would transfer to Preston's team. In return, Daniel would receive a cash payment and what Preston called access to our portfolio of development projects. He made it sound like a gift, like Daniel should feel grateful. "What's the timeline you're thinking?" Daniel asked. Preston smiled. "We'd like to move quickly. There are some projects in the pipeline that would benefit from Briggs's residential expertise. I'd want the transition complete by April." "That's 6 weeks," Daniel said. Preston shrugged. "We move fast. That's why we're successful. I noticed Daniel's hands under the table. He'd pressed them flat against his thighs, a habit from childhood, when he was trying to hold something still inside himself. He'd done it the day of his mother's funeral. I watched the whole lunch the way I'd learned to watch things over the years. The associates who never quite met Daniel's eyes. Preston checking his phone twice while Daniel was speaking. The way the proposal documents were already printed, bound, tabbed, and waiting in a leather folder by Preston's elbow. This wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. The decision had already been made. Daniel just hadn't been informed yet. In the parking garage afterward, Daniel said he thought it might be a good opportunity. The words came out careful and rehearsed, like he'd been practicing them for the drive home. "What does Claire think?" I asked. "My daughter-in-law, Daniel's wife of 6 years. Preston's daughter." He was quiet for a moment. "She thinks it would reduce the stress. On the business. On us." I drove home through Atlanta traffic thinking about what I hadn't said at lunch. About the way Preston had referred to Daniel's existing clients as "your current accounts, possessive already," like they'd already transferred. About the associates who'd been writing notes on legal pads throughout the meal. Things Preston hadn't said out loud. Old habits are hard to reason away. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything I'd observed. Not because I had a plan, just because documentation is how I think, how I've always thought, the same way some people process the world through music or prayer. 30 years of the same practice doesn't leave you simply because you've retired. The months that followed were quiet in the way that trouble is quiet before you understand it's there. Daniel signed the agreement in March. By May, Preston's team had relocated Briggs Design's office from the Midtown space Daniel had leased for 3 years to a floor in the Ashford Group building in Buckhead. By June, 2 of Daniel's senior designers had been let go. Restructuring, Preston's team called it. By July, Daniel was being excluded from client meetings for his own projects. I learned most of this not from Daniel but from his assistant, a young woman named Tamara who'd been with Briggs Design since the beginning and who called me one afternoon because she didn't know who else to call. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "something is wrong. Tell me. The new contracts, the Ashford Group ones they're running through the firm, Daniel's name isn't on them. Not as creative director, not as anything. His signature block was removed from the templates 2 weeks ago. She emailed me copies of 3 contracts. I printed them and added them to a folder I'd already started. Daniel came to Marietta for dinner on a Sunday in August. He'd lost weight. Not the Emma kind of weight loss. Not bruises. Nothing like that. But the kind that happens when a person is quietly running out of something essential. We ate on the back porch. I made Carol's pot roast recipe, the one that takes 4 hours and fills the whole house. After dinner, Daniel sat holding his coffee and staring at the yard where he'd kicked a soccer ball against the back fence for years. "Dad, I think I made a mistake. Tell me what's happening," he told me. The clients Preston's team had rerouted away from Daniel, the junior staff who now reported to an Ashford Group manager instead of Daniel. The project in Midtown, that had been Daniel's concept from the first site visit, the one with the sustainable materials, and the community garden rooftop that had gotten written up in Atlanta magazine, and how Preston had presented it at a development conference last month without mentioning Daniel's name once. He said the firm would perform better if I focused on design and let his people handle client relationships. But the clients are going, and the design decisions are being overruled. And last week, he said in a different voice, he told Claire that if I cause problems, if I make any noise about any of this, he'll make sure Briggs Design is dissolved. Assets to Ashford Group. And I'll have nothing. I looked at my son across the table. 47 years old, Harvard-trained architect, who had spent every honest dollar he had building something from the ground up, and who was watching it be systematically taken while his father-in-law smiled and called it opportunity. "What about Claire?" she said to trust her father. "That he knows what he's doing. That this is what success looks like." There was something in his voice when he said her name. Not anger. Something worse. Resignation. I told Daniel I understood. That I'd think about it. That I was glad he'd told me. After he left, I went to my study. The room Carol had always called my cave. Shelves of case files converted to books after retirement. a desk that had survived 3 office moves, photographs I didn't display anywhere else in the house. I opened the folder I'd been building since March. Tamara's contract documents, notes from the lunch in February, printouts of the Ashford Group's public financial filings going back 3 years. I'd been doing what I always do, watching, documenting, waiting to understand what I was actually looking at. What I was looking at, I now believed, was fraud. Not the dramatic kind, the kind that hides in plain sight dressed as business. Preston Ashford hadn't simply pushed Daniel out of his own company. He'd used the acquisition to fold Briggs Design's assets, its client relationships, its project pipeline, its reputation, into the Ashford Group's portfolio, while paying Daniel a fraction of what those assets were worth. And based on the financial filings I'd been reading, some of the revenue routing looked unusual in ways that had nothing to do with Daniel. Ways that a former federal government employee with 30 years in a very specific field might recognize immediately. I called Tamara the next morning. She sent me everything she had. Contracts, internal emails, billing records she'd retained copies of before her own access was restricted. I sat with those documents for 2 weeks, made notes, cross-referenced dates, built a timeline on the yellow legal pad the way I'd built timelines for 30 years. Billing structures that didn't match reported income, client payments routed through subsidiary accounts, revenue that appeared in the Ashford Group's filings in amounts that didn't correspond to the contracts I was looking at. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't move quickly or speak loudly. Carol used to say that was my most maddening quality, and also the one she loved most. She said I was the only person she'd ever met who could be completely still while everything around him was on fire. The fire was here now. I was still. I kept building the file. Preston called me directly in September. Not Daniel. Me. He'd gotten my number from Claire, I assumed. The call came on a Wednesday morning. "Briggs," he said, not bothering with a greeting. "I understand Daniel's been talking to you about the business. He talks to me about a lot of things. I'd appreciate it if you'd encourage him to focus on his role and trust the process." "Daniel built that firm," I said. "His name is on every project in that building. That firm now operates within a larger structure. He's been compensated appropriately for the transition. $300,000 for a business with 11 employees and a $2.4 million annual revenue, according to the financial filings. That's not appropriate. That's acquisition." Preston was quiet for a moment. I'd done the math. He could tell. "You should stay in your lane," he said. "And what lane would that be? You're a retired federal worker living in Marietta. This is a business matter between adults with experience in these things. You don't have the background to understand what you're looking at. I've been looking at documents like this for 30 years. Another pause. "Longer this time. Whatever you think you know," he said carefully. "I'd encourage you to be very careful about what you do with it. Daniel and Claire have a life together. 2 kids, a home. Disrupting that isn't something a good father does." I thanked him for calling, said I'd think about everything he'd said. Hung up. Added the date and time of the call to the legal pad. Filed the threat with the rest of the documentation. The call I'd been expecting from Preston was different from the one I got from Daniel on a Thursday evening in October. "Dad, I need you to come over. Now." Something in his voice that hadn't been there before. I drove to their house in Decatur in 20 minutes. Daniel met me at the door. Inside, the house was quiet in the way houses go quiet when children are present, but adults are in conflict. My grandchildren, Marcus and Sophie, 6 and 4, were upstairs. I could hear the television. Claire sat at the kitchen table. She didn't look at me when I came in. "My father called," Daniel said. "He told me, you've been looking at financial documents." Threatening him. I didn't threaten anyone. He said if you talk to anyone about the business, he'll file suit against you for corporate espionage. He'll have Claire file for divorce. He said he'll make sure Marcus and Sophie are raised understanding that their grandfather on your side tried to destroy their family's future. I sat down at the kitchen table across from Claire. She was staring at her hands. "Claire," I said. She looked up. Her eyes were red. "Do you believe that? That I tried to destroy anything?" She didn't answer. Your father has been systematically removing Daniel from a business Daniel built. I said it quietly, not angrily, just as a fact. Claire, that's not. He's building something larger, something that will benefit all of us. The client accounts that were rerouted without Daniel's knowledge, the contracts that removed his name, the billing structures that don't match the revenue in the public filings, those aren't family benefits. Those are crimes. Daniel stared at me. Dad, what are you talking about? I looked at my son. I've been building a case for 7 months, I said. I know what I'm looking at. How? Because it's what I did for 30 years. I wasn't a mailman, Daniel. I was a special agent with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. 30 years. Financial fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. I retired as a senior special agent. The silence in that kitchen was specific. The kind that happens when someone you thought you knew becomes briefly unrecognizable. You were IRS? Daniel said it slowly, like trying out words in a new language. Criminal investigation. Not the auditors, the investigators. Federal badge, federal authority, federal courts. I put away a state senator from Georgia in 2009, a hospital network executive in 2014, a real estate developer in 2017 who thought his charitable foundation made him untouchable. That last one got Preston's attention, I noticed. Even though he wasn't in the room, Claire had gone completely still. Why didn't you ever tell us? Daniel asked. Because it wasn't relevant until now. Because the job makes enemies. Because I wanted to be your father first, not a federal agent who happened to be your father. I've spent 4 years since your mother passed being exactly that, your father. But your father has 30 years of very specific training, and what Preston Ashford has been doing to your company looks remarkably similar to cases I've worked. Daniel sat down. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do we do?" I told him to let me make a call. The call was to a woman I'd worked with for 11 years. She'd been a junior agent when I met her and was now running the Atlanta field office of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Her name doesn't matter here. What matters is that she answered on the second ring and said, "I was wondering when you'd call," which told me she'd already been watching Preston Ashford for reasons that had nothing to do with me. That happens sometimes. A name shows up on enough radar screens in enough different places that the machinery starts moving before any individual pulls any particular lever. I told her what I had. She told me what they had. We agreed on timing. Preston called a family dinner for the following Saturday. His house in Buckhead. He'd apparently decided that the direct approach required a direct setting. All of us, his message read, family matters to discuss. I dressed the same way I always dress. Dark slacks, a plain button shirt, the kind of jacket that costs $40 and has lasted 15 years. Daniel drove. In the car, he asked me twice if I was sure about this. I told him what I'd always told myself before a difficult interview. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to know where you're standing. We know where we're standing. Preston's dining room could seat 20. There were 6 of us. Preston at the head, Diane beside him, silent in the way she always seemed silent, jewelry and caution. Claire next to Daniel, looking at the centerpiece instead of at anyone's face. Me at the far end, which Preston had arranged deliberately. He poured wine without asking preferences, began speaking before the first course arrived. "I'll get directly to the point," he said. "There are some people in this family who have misunderstood the nature of the business arrangement between Ashford Group and Briggs Design." He was looking at me, not Daniel. "I want that misunderstanding corrected tonight." I waited. "What misunderstanding?" I asked. That any part of this arrangement was anything other than standard acquisition practice. Daniel was compensated. The firm has grown under Ashford management. Anyone suggesting otherwise is either confused or acting in bad faith. I reached into my jacket pocket and set a single sheet of paper on the table. That's a summary of billing discrepancies between Briggs Design's reported client revenue and the corresponding entries in Ashford Group's consolidated financial filings from March through August. About $460,000 in routed payments that don't match the originating contracts. Preston looked at the paper without touching it. Where did you get those numbers? From public filings, internal contracts, and bank routing information that Tamara retained copies of before her access was restricted. Preston's expression shifted. Something behind his eyes that wasn't there a moment before. Tamara doesn't have authorization to share internal. She didn't share internal documents. She shared documents that were generated under Briggs' design before it was absorbed. Her copies were legitimate. Diane had stopped eating. Claire's hands were in her lap. Daniel was very still. Preston stood. He was good at making the act of standing feel like authority. Whatever you think you have, he said. You're an old man in a $40 jacket who doesn't understand how corporate finance works at this level. I've built what this family has. Every school your grandchildren will attend, every vacation Claire has ever taken, every opportunity Daniel has had since he joined this family came from me. You walked in here with a piece of paper and 30 years of federal mythology, and you think that gives you something? My badge number was 3744, I said. My final case supervisor was Deputy Director Elaine Marsh, Atlanta Field Office. My last case before retirement was the Kellerman Medical Group. 12 defendants, all convicted. $230 million in unreported income. If you'd like to verify any of that, you're welcome to call the IRS Criminal Investigation Division's Atlanta office. They have my file. Preston laughed. It was the kind of laugh that's meant to fill a room and dismiss everything in it. FBI, IRS, what's the difference? I play golf with half the federal judiciary in this state. You think your old colleagues are going to? I'm not asking my old colleagues to do anything, I said. They're already doing it. The Atlanta field office opened an inquiry into Ashford Group's tax reporting 3 months ago. I've been providing supplemental documentation since October. Preston stopped laughing. What? The billing discrepancies I mentioned aren't just a civil matter between a father and his son-in-law. They represent unreported income, routed payments that don't appear on the appropriate returns. That's criminal tax fraud at the federal level, Mr. Ashford. Your golf connections are state level. Federal charges don't go to those courts. You're bluffing, Diane said. It was the first time she'd spoken all evening. I looked at her kindly. I've been doing this work for 30 years, I said. I don't bluff. I build cases. Preston moved fast. He grabbed the paper off the table and crumpled it. That's a copy, I said. Daniel. He reached into his jacket and set 3 more copies on the table. Preston turned to Daniel. You're going to let your father do this? To Claire? To your children? Daniel looked at his father-in-law for a long moment. You took my company, he said. His voice was steady. You removed my name from my own work. You told my wife to keep me quiet with threats about our kids. His jaw tightened. He took my company and you called it family. So yes, I'm going to let my father handle it. Preston reached across the table and grabbed Daniel's arm. His grip was hard, the grip of a man accustomed to using physical presence as punctuation. That's enough, I said. My voice didn't rise. Preston didn't let go. I said, let go of my son. Make me, he said. All right. I picked up my phone, dialed from memory. Susan, it's Walter Briggs. I'm at 1200 Habersham Road in Buckhead. I'm witnessing criminal intimidation of a cooperating witness. Yes, the documentation's already been submitted. We're on scene. Preston released Daniel's arm. Who are you calling? IRS Criminal Investigation, Atlanta Field Office. Agents are approximately 14 minutes out. I gave them this address this afternoon as a likely location for tonight. Preston went to the back door. The agents at the rear entrance will find that door interesting, I said. They've been there since 9 o'clock. He stopped, turned around. His face had the color of old cement. What is this? This, I said, is 30 years of patient work meeting one dinner party. Please sit down, Mr. Ashford. It will go better if you're seated when they come in. 4 agents. 2 came through the front, 2 through the back as promised. Susan led the front team. She's 54 years old, has the posture of someone who never relaxed in her life, and shook my hand with the same grip she had in 2003 when I trained her on financial documentation. Agent Briggs. Senior Special Agent Briggs is retired. I'm just Walter now. She surveyed the dining room with the practiced eye of someone who has walked into 100 rooms where the people inside wished she hadn't. The Ashford Group inquiry has been active since July, she said for the room's benefit. Mr. Briggs has been a confidential informant since October, providing supplemental documentation on internal billing practices. Mr. Ashford, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. This is absurd, Preston said. I have attorneys. Call them from the field office, Susan said pleasantly. Preston Ashford, you are under arrest on federal charges including criminal tax evasion and wire fraud. She looked at her team. Diane Ashford, please remain in the room. We'll need your statement. Preston was led through his own front door in handcuffs. Through that front window, which faced a street full of Buckhead houses, where the neighbors had cameras on their porches and would talk about this for years. He turned back once, looked at me with an expression that wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire life believing that money and connection were a kind of immunity, and who was encountering, perhaps for the first time, the limits of that belief. I didn't say anything, just watched him go. Claire sat at the dining room table for a long time after the agents finished with her. Daniel was in the kitchen. I sat across from my daughter-in-law in the emptied room and waited. He told me it was a good opportunity, she finally said. When he first proposed the acquisition, he said it would take the pressure off Daniel. Off us. I know. She looked up. I believed him. I know that too. She folded her hands on the table. He's my father. I said nothing. Waited. After a while, she said, Daniel built something real. Didn't he? Yes, he really did. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd known for a while and hadn't permitted herself to say. We stayed at a hotel that night, the four of us. I booked 2 rooms on the same floor. In the morning, I took Marcus and Sophie to the hotel breakfast while Daniel and Claire talked. My grandson wanted to know why we were having breakfast at a hotel. I told him sometimes adults have to sort things out and then everyone feels better. He accepted this with the philosophical flexibility of a 6-year-old and asked for extra syrup. Sophie climbed into the chair next to me and put her head against my arm the way small children do when they've decided you're safe. I sat there in a hotel breakfast room in Buckhead with my grandchildren on either side of me and thought about Carol. She'd always said I had the patience of a man who couldn't be surprised by anything. She meant it as a complaint and a compliment in equal measure. I thought she'd have found the last 7 months funny, in the particular way she found my professional life funny. She used to say, you spend all day chasing people who steal money and then come home to forget to charge for the painting you did for the neighbors. She wasn't wrong about that. The federal case moved quickly once it started, the way federal cases do when the documentation is thorough. The preliminary charges included criminal tax evasion on $460,000 in unreported routed income, wire fraud across state lines in connection with the Briggs design acquisition, and obstruction of a federal inquiry related to the earlier audit that had been running before I provided supplemental documentation. Preston's legal team cost him more in the first month than he'd paid Daniel for the entire company. His attorneys were good. They were not as good as the 30 years of financial documentation that had been building in file boxes since July. Susan called me with updates every 2 weeks, the professional courtesy of a former colleague. The forensic accountants, she said in November, finished the full audit. The unreported income extends beyond the Briggs matter. There are 3 other transactions with similar routing structures over the past 5 years. The total exposure is closer to $2 million. I sat with that number for a moment. That's not a mistake, I said. No, she agreed. It's a pattern. Daniel filed suit to recover Briggs' design in December. The civil action ran parallel to the criminal case. His attorneys argued, with the documentation I'd provided, that the acquisition had been executed under fraudulent pretenses, that Daniel had been misrepresented the value and structure of the deal, and that the systematic removal of his name and authority constituted breach of the acquisition agreement's creative control provisions. Preston's company, occupied entirely with the federal matter, settled the civil case in February. Briggs Design returned to Daniel's full ownership. The client relationships were restored. The 2 designers who'd been let go were rehired. Daniel moved the office back to Midtown. He put his name back on the letterhead, in a font 2 sizes larger than before. He told me that last part, like it was a joke. It wasn't entirely a joke. The criminal trial came in March. Judge Patricia Okafor, Northern District of Georgia, Federal Courthouse, downtown Atlanta. I know that courthouse the way you know places where you've spent significant portions of your working life. The particular quality of the light in the morning, the coffee from the cart on the corner, the way the security guards nod at you after enough years of familiarity. I was there as a witness and as a former colleague to the prosecuting team. I wasn't the center of the case. I never was. The center of the case was $2 million in documented unreported income and a paper trail that had been built by a retired man at a kitchen table in Marietta over 7 months. Preston testified. His attorneys had advised against it, I was told later, but he'd insisted. He did not handle cross-examination well. 30 years of believing he could talk his way through anything does not prepare a man for a federal prosecutor with a complete documentation file. On the stand, Preston looked diminished in a way that the handcuffs at dinner had not quite captured. The suit was still expensive. The silver hair was still perfect, but something structural had shifted in him. The absolute certainty that his wealth placed him at a different level than the rest of the room had been quietly evacuated. Daniel did not testify. His documentation spoke for him, which is how it should work. I testified for 40 minutes. Professional background, documentation methodology, chain of custody for the supplemental materials. The defense tried to suggest bias. A father protecting his son. I told them what I'd told juries for 30 years. The documents don't have feelings, I said. I do. The documents are what matter here. The jury deliberated 2 days. On the count of criminal tax evasion, guilty. On the count of wire fraud, guilty. On the count of obstruction of a federal inquiry, guilty. Preston Ashford received a federal sentence of 5 years and 11 months, full restitution of the $2 million in unreported income plus penalties, and 3 years supervised release. He was 62 years old. He would be 68 when he walked out of a federal facility. Everything he'd spent 40 years building would be managed by attorneys and trustees in his absence, which is not the same thing as managing it yourself, and Preston Ashford had always understood that distinction very clearly. As they led him out of the courtroom, he looked at me. I've thought about that look a lot since. Not anger, not defiance, something more like bewilderment. He'd spent his entire professional life operating from the assumption that the people with less money were also the people with less power. He'd looked at a retired man in a modest house in Marietta and seen exactly what he expected to see. He'd been catastrophically wrong about what he was looking at. I didn't say anything. I'd said everything I needed to say over the course of 7 months in the form of organized documentation. That's always been my preferred language. Outside the courthouse, Daniel and Claire stood on the steps with Marcus and Sophie. My grandson was wearing a tie because Daniel had told him it was an important day, and Marcus had decided that ties were how you marked important days. He looked exactly like Daniel at that age, which meant he looked like a small version of a man trying very hard to appear calm about something he found overwhelming. Claire had her arm through Daniel's. She'd testified at the civil proceeding, not the criminal trial. Offered an account of the acquisition negotiations that corroborated the documentation and conflicted with her father's representations. That had cost her something. I could see it in the careful way she moved, like a person being gentle with a recent injury. But she was there. She'd made her choice, and she was standing in it. "Grandpa," Marcus said when he saw me, "did the judge do the right thing?" "Yes," I said. "She did. Good," he said with considerable satisfaction, and straightened his tie. We drove out to Marietta for dinner. I made the pot roast again. Marcus and Sophie ran in the backyard while the food finished. I stood at the kitchen window watching them, and thought about all the years Daniel had run in that same yard. The soccer ball against the fence. The summer he was 11, and convinced himself he could build a fort in the oak tree and got 6 feet up before reconsidering. Carol standing at this same window watching him with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and a smile that was equal parts love and amusement. After dinner, after the children were asleep in the guest room, Daniel and Claire sat with me on the back porch. The Georgia night was cool and clear, the kind of evening that feels like a held breath. "Dad," Daniel said, "all those years, all those cases you worked, you never told me any of it. I didn't need to. You weren't in those cases. You were in this house, in school, at soccer. That was the life I wanted you to have. But you were building cases the whole time. When it mattered, yes." He shook his head slowly. "Preston thought you were nobody." I let him think that. Claire looked at me. "Why didn't you move sooner? When you first suspected something?" "Because timing is the difference between an arrest and an acquittal. Because a case built in weeks falls apart in court. A case built in months holds. I've watched impatient investigators lose prosecutable cases because they moved before the documentation was complete. Preston showed me who he was, 1 month at a time. Every routing structure, every rerouted client, every contract that removed Daniel's name. Each one was evidence. Taken together, they were a conviction. That's a very calm way to destroy someone's plans," Claire said. I looked at her. "I didn't destroy anything. Preston did what he did. I documented it. The legal system processed the facts. That's how it's supposed to work." She was quiet for a moment. She'd grown up with a father who operated as though systems were things you hired people to navigate around. The idea that systems could simply work, if the documentation was complete, seemed to sit with her like something she was trying to fit into a frame that had always been slightly the wrong size. "My father always said the only thing that matters is who you know," she said finally. "I've been thinking about that. What do you think now?" "I think he knew a lot of people," I said. "And a federal judge still gave him 6 years. She almost smiled. Almost. "The months after are quieter now, in the best sense. Daniel's firm is his again. All 11 employees. New projects coming in. His name on the letterhead, in the larger font. He called last week to tell me they'd won a commission for a community center in East Atlanta. Sustainable design, rooftop garden, everything he'd always wanted to build. He sounded like himself again. I recognized the voice. Claire comes to Marietta for dinner most Sundays. She and I are learning each other without the distortion that Preston created between us. It's slow. It's honest. That's enough. Marcus brought me a drawing 2 weeks ago. A house with a big backyard, a man with gray hair, and what appeared to be a briefcase. "Grandpa at work," he explained. I told him I was retired. He said the briefcase meant important. I hung it on the refrigerator. I sat in my study last night, the room Carol called my cave, and looked at the photographs I keep there. 30 years of federal service, case files and commendations, team photographs, a newspaper article from 2014 with a headline about a hospital network and 12 convictions. The record of a career spent finding the places where money and power had been used as weapons and making sure the legal system had everything it needed to respond. Then I looked at the other photographs. Carol and me on our wedding day, young and unaware of most of what was coming. Daniel at his college graduation. Daniel and Claire at their wedding. Marcus's first birthday. Sophie, learning to walk in this very room, holding on to the edge of the bookcase. Those photographs are not a record of a career. They're a record of a life. The career was how I spent my working hours. The life is what the career was always in service of. Preston Ashford spent 40 years accumulating the kind of power that requires everyone around you to be smaller. He needed to be the largest thing in every room. He needed his son-in-law to be manageable, his daughter to be loyal in ways that required her to be small, and me to be exactly what I appeared, an old man in a modest house who had no recourse against a man of his caliber. He was wrong about all of it. He was most wrong about me. Not because of what I did for 30 years, because of what I did for 47. I raised a son who built something honest with his own hands, and when someone tried to take it, I remembered everything I'd ever known about how to make a case. Preston Ashford sat in a cell in a federal facility in South Georgia, learning what I'd spent a career teaching people like him. That the quietest person at the dinner table is not always the least dangerous. That the man who doesn't need to announce his power is often the one who has the most of it. and that you should be very careful about who you dismiss as nobody. Because sometimes, nobody has 30 years of federal training and a very well-organized filing system. And sometimes, that's everything. If this story moved you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read everything. Click the video on your screen to hear the next story.